Please take your seats, ladies and gentlemen, and can we request us, all of you to switch off your mobiles or make them mute, please? Thank you.
Good evening. Is this on? Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yes. Good evening. Welcome to AYUCA, the 27th Foundation Day lecture. So 27th means that AYUCA was founded in 1988 at the end of the year. And every year since then, we've had the Foundation Day lecture as one of the high points in our academic calendar. And normally, even though we are an institution where astronomy and astrophysics is taught and worked upon, the Foundation Day lecture draws from a very, very wide range of subjects. And I'm absolutely, amazingly happy this year to welcome Professor Madhav Gadgil to our Foundation Day lecture. He, of course, is not an astronomer, and of course, this is what we want our Foundation Day lecture to be like, because we try to see connections between the various sciences and also with the humanities. In various events we have throughout the year, we have the extramural talks and colloquia, but in the Foundation Day lecture, we do invite pioneers in various fields to come and talk about their thinking and their field. Professor Gadgil started his academic career at the University of Bombay, where he did his MSc and then set sail for Harvard University. In his memoirs, Ecological Journeys, and in various other books like Michael Lewis's account in Inventing Global Ecology, we find a very wonderful description of what happened next. And this is if there are young people here, quite an interesting story for how academic careers start. Professor Gadgil actually went to Harvard after meeting, because the famous marine ecologist Giles Mead, who was the curator of fishes at the Harvard Museum of Comparative Zoology. He was in India, in Bombay, working on an expedition studying ocean wildlife in and around the Indian Ocean. And so, of course, he was very impressed with meeting Professor Gadgil, and then invited him to come to Harvard to do his PhD. So he set sail, and of course, he writes in his autobiography, his memoirs. So I was accepted to Harvard. Luckily enough, so was Sulochana, my fiancée, and one of Ferguson's college's bright students. And she, of course, had gone into mathematics. And so we were married after getting our respective master's degrees and went both to Harvard to do our PhDs. I'm very happy to say that Professor Sulochana Gadgil is here today with us. Then, when he reached there, of course, at Harvard, you take courses before starting your research. And Professor Gadgil then encountered Ed Wilson, who was in his 30s at that time, the legendary ecologist. And his course in evolutionary biology kind of changed his mind about working with Giles Mead, because for Giles Mead, who was a naturalist working on a class of fishes and marine biology, here was somebody who was actually talking about a very generalized subject, and not just a naturalist, but talking about ecological theory. And this is where one generalizes from species into the theory of the subject. At Harvard, he writes, one had to do coursework for the first 2 years, and they decided that I knew enough biology, so I started taking courses in mathematics, in which I had always been interested. And with Sulochana as tutor, I breezed through these. And then, of course, he says that at Harvard, his PhD, which was completed in 4 years, was the first thesis submitted at Harvard by a biology student but based on mathematical modeling. So this is subjects coming together and generalizing a very empirical field into, into the theory of the subject. And you might have noticed that today's talk, the topic of today's talk, is a very general synthesis of his thoughts, and I very look forward to what he's going to say today. Working in Wilson's group must have been an quite an experience. His supervisor was, of course, Bossert, who was one of Wilson's students. I myself, in the early 90s, attended one of U. Wilson's courses on ants, given to a very general undergraduate class of 1,200 students. And it was a completely unforgettable experience, 25 years after what the time we're talking about. And so working in Wilson's group must have been amazing in the 1960s. Professor Gadgil has been a lecturer in biology at Harvard University, a research officer at the Agarkar Research Institute, Pune, in the 70s, and then a visiting professor at Stanford and at University of California, Berkeley. But of course, the main corpus of his work was at the University of Science in Bangalore, and where he was responsible for establishing the Center for Ecological Sciences. And then since his retirement, he's been a resident of Pune, working at the Agarkar Institute. Professor Gadgil's life's work is aimed at the preservation of ecology of India. He was, as you know, the chair of the Western Ghats Ecology Expert Panel, which is also known as the Gadgil Committee, which the report was submitted in 2011. And this was instrumental in UNESCO's adding some of the sites on the Western Ghats to the World Heritage List. He's won numerous awards, including the Harvard Centennial Medal, the USC's John and Alice Tyler Prize, the Bhatnagar Award, and of course, he was honored with the Padma Bhushan in 2008. Professor Gadgil is a fellow of all 3 science academies in India and a foreign associate of the National Academy of Sciences in the US. I'm very, very thankful to Professor Madhav and Sulochana Gadgil for being here today. And I'd also like to thank our previous directors, Professor Jan Nalikaran and Professor Ajit Kembavi, and Dr. Mangala Nalikaran and Asha Kembavi to be here, for being here and attending. Thank you very much for being here this evening. I would actually like to invite Professor Ajit Kembavi to come and say a couple of things before the main lecture today.
Good evening. Shomak asked me to say a few things about Madhav Gadgil because I have known him for a very long time. I'm not going to stand between you and him as the proverbial statement goes, but let me say a few things about him. I just confirmed a few minutes ago that Madhav Gadgil was indeed the first colloquium speaker that IUCAA ever had. Okay, and he gave that lecture in the Raman Hall of the physics department, and it was on diversity, biological and cultural. Okay, so you see that the topic is not too different from here. Now, Shomak has told you everything that one should know about him. But I mean, I want to just recount a couple of personal experiences, because what happened was that when I was doing my PhD with Jayant, and just after he started doing that, he went off abroad. So I took the opportunity to go to Bangalore to the Indian Institute of Science, which I was visiting for the first time. And there, Professor Mukunda had kindly invited me to the Center for Theoretical Studies, which was then set up by George Sudarshan. So there were a few theorists, because there was Sudarshan himself, who used to come in occasionally, and Mukunda and A.K. Rajgopal and others. But there were also Madhav Gadgil, who was the ecologist, Sulochana Gadgil, who was the atmospheric scientist, and it was really an amazing collection. I went there and I looked around the place and I said, I like this. And at that time, our scholarship used to be 450 rupees, which in Bangalore went 3 times further than it did in Bombay. Everything was well, so I stayed there for a long time. So I got to know him well. And over the next few years, I occasionally went with him to the jungles and to Mudumalai and to Bandipur, and where he used to conduct seminars and the jungles of Dandeli. So which was a very uplifting and elevating experience. Okay, because I used to interact with his students at the time, and many of whom went on to become great people. Sukumar, for example, I didn't, he's much younger than I was. I didn't interact with him, but Sukumar is a great authority on elephants. and he has written a marvelous book, more than one book on them. And then, of course, there's Raghavendra Gadadkar, who was his postdoc, and we used to share rooms in the hostel. Gadadkar is now the president of INSA. So you see that he has produced a wonderful group of people. Now, I just want to recount a story which I also did when I was introducing him for the first colloquium, which was quite amazing actually. We were in the Mudumalai forest, and after having come back from the days walking around, we were just sitting by the roadside. Now, sitting down on the big, large stones there was a hazardous affair because you have to overturn the stones to make sure that there are no scorpions under them. And quite often the scorpions actually came out. And so, you know that when you have these road signs on the road, the big concrete blocks, which are about like 3-4 feet, and Madhav Gadgil was sitting on one of them, and we were a few students just standing there. And then it turned out that a few feet from there, 4-5 feet from there, was a tall pole. I don't know what it was, a pole made of wood, and it must have been like 7 feet tall, 7-8 feet tall, and it had just enough room on top where you could barely stand. Okay, but your feet were sticking out. I got the picture vividly in my mind. So when you're sitting on the wall, somebody said, "Can you climb that pole?" Okay, so he climbed the pole. Okay, and then he stood on the pole, right? No, he sat on the pole. Then somebody said that anybody can sit on poles. Can you stand up with your arms stretched out? Okay, so then he said, "Okay, I'll stand there," and he stood on the pole. Then they said, "Can you jump from the pole onto that big concrete block?" So he actually jumped and just barely managed to maintain his balance and stand on it. And they said, "Okay, now jump back." Now that was extremely dangerous, okay, because there was this concrete block you were standing on, and then there was this pole, and which was quite much taller than it, and then it was very, very small in radius, and he had to jump and stand on that, and he actually did it. Okay, he did it and then crouched on it and then stood up. So everybody clapped, but I wonder what everybody would have done if he had not quite made it to the pole. It would have been extremely dangerous, but we were all too young to understand that. So there were all these things which used to happen over the years, and now Madhav has come back to Pune. He's a great force still in the ecological circles, and we will be very glad to hear him today. Thank you.
Good afternoon. It's a great pleasure and privilege to be invited to give the Foundation Day lecture at this scientific institute of great distinction. As Ajit Kembavi said, I had the privilege of giving, I guess, the very first scientific colloquium here many years ago, before, I guess, this, well, certainly before this auditorium came into being. I was wondering what I should talk about, and one of my interests is history of science, and I thought it would be a nice opportunity to take a broad view, not only history of science in terms of human endeavor, but perhaps the whole history of information, knowledge through the evolutionary times coming to the present day. And IUCAA is a nice place to do this, because certainly the oldest of objectively documented scientific knowledge in this world comes from astronomy. If you look at that piece of bone shown on this first slide, this is apparently the world's oldest scientific document, a 34,000-year-old piece of bone depicting phases of moon found in some caves in Europe. So, as I said, astronomy is the oldest and the most the fountain source of all scientific knowledge. And I would like to go a little further back and talk about a whole range of interests I have. I have a strong interest also in the natural world, and reflecting on the situation today, I think as an ecologist, as a lover of nature, as my friend Michael Sule says, we live in a world of wounds. But also as somebody interested in science and knowledge, I think this is a golden age. There never was scientific knowledge of such wide range so readily available to any human being before as it is today. So we are simultaneously in a world which in some ways depresses me, but in other ways I am exalted that I am able to have this kind of access to knowledge. So I feel, and this is what I want to conclude with, the challenge therefore before scientists is to use this tremendous access to knowledge to try to see if we can take better care of our natural world. And I think this is possible, and this is what one should, at least personally, I'm very committed to trying to do, and I want to come to that a little later. But as a biologist, we say that life, after all, is information. And this 3.8 billion year history of life is a history of continual progress in handling larger and larger quantities of more and more complex information more and more efficiently, beginning with the very first beginnings, now believed to be in the deep ocean on what are called hydrothermal vents. In the middle of the oceans, Pacific, Indian, Atlantic, there are these mid-oceanic ridges where the volcanic eruptions are producing lava mixing up with seawater. And that is where in the dark interior of the oceans, life is supposed to have originated. And right from beginning, it has been a kind of twofold matter of progress. One, continual increase in the abilities to handle, as I said, more and more complex information, more and more efficiently, but also continual increase in a whole range of collaborative activities, cooperative activities. Evolutionists and ecologists talk a lot about conflicts going on in the natural world. But there is also a very large measure of cooperation, collaboration. And progress in the evolutionary, along the evolutionary course has been largely a matter of increasing levels of cooperation, collaboration at various steps in evolution. Life itself is a cooperative enterprise of information carrying nucleic acid molecules and of proteins which are enzymes handling these molecules. So life is at its root a cooperative enterprise of proteins and nucleic acids. And at every stage, I do not want to go through this whole evolutionary history. There is a very interesting book called Major Transitions in Evolution, which talks about 10 major steps over which various more and more elaborate ways of cooperation have led to this progress towards better and better handling of information. But just to look at a few of the steps, one of the important steps in cooperation is going from single-celled organisms to multi-celled organisms. And in the animals, diversification of the roles of the different cells in the bodies of multicellular organisms, giving rise to the nervous system. And of course, This is Hydra down here with the nerve net. These very simple animals already began to handle information far more effectively than anything which had happened over the earlier 3 billion years of history of life. And then you have social animals, where amongst the groups of animals, there is beginning of sharing of information, not only sharing of information, but possibilities of growing information. Social insects was a major step 150 million years ago. And with the social insects, you have development of, for the first time, of a symbolic language. The honeybees, they cooperate with each other, of course. It's a great cooperative group of animals. And they have a great advantage in being able to find nectar sources and pollen sources very far from their hives. And this they achieve by being able to effectively communicate where a rich nectar or pollen source is to other workers in the hive. And this information is conveyed through a so-called figure of 8 waggle dance. The direction the figure of 8 makes to the vertical direction gives precise information, pretty precise information of the direction in which the source of nectar or pollen lies in relation to the sun's movement in the sky. And the rate at which they waggle their abdomen gives pretty good information about the distance at which this source lies. So with that, with this symbolic communication, the workers are able to go exactly pretty quickly to fairly distant sources, sometimes kilometers away from the hive, without having to once again go search all over the place. Next, of course, major step is the more advanced animals, and amongst them our close relatives, the monkeys. And below there is a picture of a Japanese macaque, and there are some very interesting stories about this Japanese macaque. This troop of Japanese macaque, one particular troop of Japanese macaque, which has been studied for decades carefully, lives on a small island off the Japanese coast. And Japanese scientists were giving them a whole range of foods on the beach to familiarize them with observers who were coming to keep records. And of course, you know, monkeys can get very quickly habituated to people around them. And the Japanese scientists noted that the foods that they were keeping on the shore, they were not only being consumed as they are, as most monkeys will do, but these Japanese macaque had started processing them. And there was one lady amongst them. She was named Imo. Imo is actually a ratala in Marathi, what they call. They were giving them ratales. And Imo figured out that if you wash the ratales in the sea water, then they taste so much better and washes off mud. So she started doing this. But next, they were also putting some grains on the sand. She discovered that if you take those grains and dump them in the shallow sea water, then the sand grains will sink down, and you can, when you eat the grain, then you no more have to eat the sand. These discoveries of Imo were very quickly picked up by other members of the troop in a very interesting sequence. The young females very quickly adopted these tricks. The young males were next. The older females were next. But none of the old males agreed. They all died eating sand. And only the next generation was everybody eating, consuming the processed food. So this is a famous story of a remarkable advance in progress of knowledge amongst the animals. But humans, of course, surpass them all. As far as we understand, after the 1.2 million or whatever year-old symbolic language of honeybees, the really rich symbolic language was invented by our species only about 50,000 years ago. And the evidence of this comes in the form of many archaeological artifacts, in particular these shell ornaments and so on. Between 40 to 50,000 years ago, you begin to find this, and that's the guess is that this was when the modern kind of rich communication system in terms in form of symbolic languages came into being. And with that, it became possible for the first time for any animal species to really actively teach and grow information, grow knowledge. And now anthropologists talk about the key to the success of human species is their invention of what is called as technically cognitive niche, that humans began to develop, devour information, knowledge, and that allowed us to dominate the rest of the biosphere. Now, of course, there is, of course, also a lot of very interesting discussion on when you have symbolic language, of course, you can convey truth, but you can also tell lies. And the question has been asked whether animals can tell lies. And yes, monkeys can tell lies. And actually, one of my friends, Rana Sinha, he has the most interesting story of lies in the monkey world. Ajit Kebab, I think, was mentioning about our spending time in Bandipur. So Rana Sinha also used to spend time in Bandipur watching the southern bonnet macaque, the red-faced monkey. And one day he noticed that there was this love triangle. There were two males after one female. And one of the males was rejected. In dejection, he climbed to the top of the tree. The other two were down at the base of the tree. And on reaching the top, he had this brainwave. He gave a signal that the monkeys have specific alarm calls. So there are specific calls for a predator like a panther, which is approaching on the ground. There is also a specific signal for aerial predators. There are these large eagles and so on, which can also hunt monkeys, coming from up above. So this monkey at the top of this rejected lover at the top of the tree gave the signal saying that there was a panther approaching. So the poor pair of lovers broke apart and ran helter-skelter. And this chap saw that, and after they were separated, he climbed down the tree, well, apparently laughing to himself. Obviously, if there was a genuine panther around, he would have never climbed down the tree. He would have stayed up there. So he was clearly telling lies. So there monkeys can tell lies, but of course monkeys can never reach the heights of telling lies which humans have reached. So the course of progress of knowledge, if I may say so, has been through interplay of accumulating, sharing sound information, often used to control the world. A whole lot of technologies have come out of this knowledge, but also attempts not to share information, to monopolize information, to keep information of value to oneself, and then propagate deliberately misleading information to manipulate other human beings. And one sees an interplay of this all along in the long history of knowledge. So what are recognized as sources of knowledge? Broadly, one may say three kinds of sources of knowledge have been recognized. There is divine revelations. A whole lot of knowledge is supposed to have come from divine revelations. Then there are indisputable, uncontestable authority. Lot of knowledge flows from such authority. And finally, of course, empirical observations. And empirical observations is clearly the most important source, and in a way, as I started showing you, just to illustrate the insistence on divine origin or revelations as a source of knowledge and uncontestable authority as what should be accepted, we have the Vedas. And Vedas are supposed to be apaurushaya. They come from divine sources, and they are supposed to be an authority that should never be contested. It has to be accepted. But also in terms of monopolizing this knowledge, the tradition has been that Vedas are accessible only to high caste males, which means maybe the total high caste population is 12 to 20% of Indian population, and females are kept out. The Shudras and the women have no access to Vedas, which means that only 6 to 10% of Indian population had access to what was considered uncontestable knowledge, and in fact, all of knowledge that was of any value. I even had a professor of physics at Banaras Hindu University tell me a few years ago that all of physics is in the Vedas. Now, of course, I have tried to read Rigveda and I found some physics. Of course, I don't know all of physics, but anyway, of course, I have not read all of Rigveda. Nevertheless, I think this is a statement which is nonsensical statement. But the point is that even today there are people who believe all knowledge is in the Vedas, and certainly traditionally this was accepted. And so all knowledge was accessible only to a small minority of the population. However, it was very clear that the real source of knowledge is empirical observation. And I started off with this 34,000-year-old piece of bone, the earliest scientific document, as they say, known to us today, which is a depiction of phases of moon clearly based on careful empirical observation. And the depiction also tries to take care of conveying fairly accurately the progress of the phases of the moon. This assertion of Vedic knowledge being source of all knowledge, the Vedas being source of all knowledge, and being accessible to only a minority of the population, that was one major challenge was by Gautam Buddha. And here is a quotation, an interesting quotation from Gautam Buddha. It's clearly a rationalist. He says, "Believe nothing, no matter where you read it or who has said it, not even if I have said it, unless it agrees with your own reason and your own common sense." So this is in some sense a clear statement of what scientific knowledge today is supposed to be. Interestingly enough, the famous pose of Buddha, which he is supposed to have assumed when he received enlightenment under the Bodhi tree, is called Bhumi Sparsha Mudra. This depicts this Bhumi Sparsha Mudra. He points to the earth as the source of all knowledge. That knowledge comes from concrete experiences on this earth, not from some divine revelations, not from some abstract authority. And the influence of Buddhism is revealed very interestingly in perhaps the only Sanskrit play, one of the classic Sanskrit plays, which is supposed to depict real life in the society. You know, famous plays like Abhinyan Shakuntalam, mythological, or Kalidasa's Malavikagnimitra and so on, they are court romances. They did not depict what was going on in the society. Mruchakatika is a play set in Ujjaini of, it is not clear, maybe third or second century before Christian era. And there is important figures in the play are Buddhist monks. So Buddhist influence was still very much around. And the plot of the play involves a tyrannical wicked king who had completely unjustifiably jailed a cowherd, a young cowherd called Aryaka. Of course, the main story is about Charudatta and Vasantasena and their romance, but the Charudatta was falsely accused of having murdered Vasantasena, as you know. Anyway, Aryaka, who was jailed by this tyrannical king, breaks out of the jail, goes, throttles the king, and assumes the throne, and then, of course, pardons Charudatta, who is made actually a major governor of one of the provinces. So here is a story of a Shudra. This cowherd was clearly a Shudra. He went and throttled high caste Kshatriya and assumed kinghood. So these are evidences that the Buddhist revolution perhaps did actually have serious impacts on the social structure, and of course, in our story of the history of knowledge, on freeing the strangled hold on knowledge of a small class of, small group of people. Bhagavad Gita, there are a lot of disputes exactly when it was written, is, I think, and Kosambi and many others have interpreted it as primarily a response to Buddhism. And amongst the statements in Bhagavad Gita is this one, Adnyaha adi ashraddhadhanaha. Ignorant, and very interestingly, those who do not accept faith, these skeptical people will perish. Saushayatma vidashyati. Those who will be skeptical will perish unless they have full faith. So the Buddhist prescription of not believing anything unless it agrees with your reason is questioned, that you must have absolute faith. And indeed, in the Indian tradition, as Buddhism receded, Vedas and Gita, they came to be accepted as uncontestable authority, and an uncontestable authority which tried to re-establish the social order, including this complete monopoly over knowledge, which Buddhism had tried to overthrow. An interesting other insight into how knowledge is to be treated comes from a treatise called Tao Te Ching, written by Laozi, who was a contemporary of Buddha, more or less. This is a Chinese treatise, and in that Laozi has the following advice. Ancients who practiced the way is his way of saying the right way of doing things, did not enlighten people with it. They used it rather to stupefy them. People are hard to rule when they have too much knowledge. Therefore, ruling a state through knowledge is to rock the state. Ruling a state through ignorance brings stability to the state. So the rulers must always attempt to keep people ignorant. And of course, this is what the rulers have always tried to do right to the present day, as I will come to talk about. Now coming back to development of knowledge. As I said, there have been three major sources, one may say, divine revelations, unquestionable authority, and empirical observations. Now, Aristotle, Greeks of course, made important contributions to elaboration of knowledge, and Aristotle was one of the leading figures. He compiled knowledge, and of course he went much further. He, for example, devised a whole system of logic which has had a major influence on scientific developments. Now, Aristotle talks about many things. Amongst them, he talks about physics also, astronomy, and biology, natural history, everything. Now, one of the statements he makes is that women have fewer teeth than men. And as Bertrand Russell says, he had 2 wives, one after the other. Aristotle could have avoided the mistake of thinking that women have fewer teeth than men by the simple device of asking Mrs. Aristotle to keep her mouth open while he counted, which, and he had 2 of them, he never did, obviously. So, all sorts of assertions being made without realizing that it was important to actually verify the validity in an empirical fashion. Aristotle continued as a great authority. Coming back to our own system of knowledge, Ayurveda, which is obviously a very important system of knowledge about medicine of Indian origin. There are 3 major texts of Ayurveda: Charaka Samhita, Sushruta Samhita, and Vagbhata's Ashtanga Hridaya. Now, in all of these, not in Vagbhata clearly, I'm not sure, but in Charaka and Sushruta, in the initial verses, there is a mention that the knowledge has come from Ashwini Kumars. But later on, in Charaka and Sushruta, you have verses like this, that Gopala tapasa vyadha annecha vanacharana mulaharascha yetebhyo bheshaja vyaktirikshate, which says that medicinal plants are really part of life of known very well to Gopalas, the cowherds, Tapasaha, the sages in the forest, Vyadha, the hunters, and other forest dwellers, and those who live by eating the roots in the forest. So it is these people who have real knowledge of medicinal plants, and both Charaka and Sushruta recommend that the Ayurvedic Vaidyas should interact with these people and acquire this knowledge. So on one side, they are talking about experiential knowledge which should be acquired by the Vaidyas, but on the other side, in the preamble, they are talking of all knowledge coming from Ashwini Kumars, being of divine origin, and in fact not changing after the Ashwini Kumars revealed that knowledge to the sages. Interestingly enough, the third of these Trimurtis, the Charaka, Sushruta, and Vagbhata, was a Buddhist from Sindh, and he was driven out of Sindh because of his Buddhist affiliation. He came to Kerala, and in Kerala, he compiled his Ashtanga Hridaya, and there is one more text, his Ayurvedic texts, which were made available. Vagbhata himself is supposed to have had disciples from all classes of people, including Ilavas, who were treated earlier as low caste people, who had very much Shudras, but not even Shudras, amongst the then Asprushas. Nevertheless, there were major Ayurvedic Vaidyas amongst the Ilavas, and a special concession was made in Kerala that the Ilavas can learn Sanskrit, but they can learn Sanskrit only to read Vagbhata's compositions. They should not use their knowledge of Sanskrit to read Vedas or to read Gita. And you might have heard of Narayana Guru, who was a major social reformer of Kerala, who was an Ilava, and because of the permission given to Ilavas to learn Sanskrit, to read Vagbhata's text, he knew Sanskrit, and then he said, I am not going to accept this restriction on not reading Gita and Vedas and all other scriptures. He mastered them, and then in fact he went ahead to bring about a major social revolution in Kerala. Anyway, what was happening in course, all knowledge was in Sanskrit, in the Maharashtrian society also, and Vedas and Gita were the major source of knowledge, which was not open to people at large. Jnaneshwar took the revolutionary step of bringing what was in Gita to people through the Marathi famous composition Jnaneshwari. But it is part of Gita, and of course, it echoes what is in the Gita, including the fact that the fourth of the Varnas, the Shudras, for them, Veda is not accessible. This is, of course, part of a statement from Gita. So, Jnaneshwari, although it brought Gita to the common people, also asserted that yes, there is this hierarchy that the Shudras, and of course women are never mentioned, but they are also treated on par with Shudras as far as access to knowledge is concerned. They have no access to this important source of knowledge. It was Ekanath who was the next major revolutionary saint of Maharashtra, who wrote Ekanathi Bhagavat, which is a commentary broadly on philosophy of life. It does not endorse the way Jnaneshwari, because it's a rendition of Gita, continues to endorse the caste system and its hierarchy. Ekanath himself, through many of his actions, is famous to have broken caste barriers. Very interestingly, I will come to that a little later, I was recently reading an interesting book called Culture of Wikipedia. And Wikipedia, which is open to everybody, was criticized vehemently for many years and continues to be criticized. But it's especially in initial years criticized vehemently that opening up all knowledge to common people is dangerous, wrong, improper. And there is a PhD thesis from Stanford University on all this. And I was reading through all that debate. And then I looked at what was written in times of Ekanath. And the Sanskrit Pandits also attacked Ekanath, exactly saying more or less the same things, which the critics of Wikipedia are saying today. That yes, common people, you should not open knowledge to them in this fashion. Ekanath wrote not only Bhagavat, but a number of other texts in Marathi, opening up what was for them importantly Adhyatmic knowledge to all people. That this is wrong, that all this must be kept confined to Sanskrit and to narrow group of people. It was later in the next century that Tukaram went further, attacking this monopoly than Ekanath, saying, Bara deva kunabi kelo nahi tar dambhe asato melo. And that I am glad that you made me a low caste Shudra, O God. Otherwise, I would have died of false pride and hypocrisy. I want to also tell you of one of my personal experiences, echoing this maybe. There is a biosphere reserve in the country. There is now a set of biosphere reserves. The first biosphere reserve was established in the Nilgiris in 1986. And I was asked to prepare the project document for that. I had prepared it, on the basis of which this first biosphere reserve was established. Then in 1995, I was asked to review the impact of this biosphere reserve. What difference had it made to the conservation of the, especially biodiversity in that area? Now, Nilgiris are important for their hill stream fishes. There are a whole lot of rapid streams on the hill slopes of Nilgiris, which are fish genera, Bhavania and many others, which are found nowhere else in the world. So, hill stream fish diversity was an important issue. And one of the themes which my review had to deal with was what had been happening to these hill stream fish diversity as a result of the establishment of this biosphere reserve. So Jayaraman, who was the leading authority on freshwater fishes, he was Joint Director of Zoological Survey of India, a good friend of mine. I asked him, what is the scientific evidence available on the hill stream fishes of Nilgiris and possible impact of the biosphere reserve? And Jayaraman said that, look, in the 1930s, Sundarlal Hora had studied these fishes, after which no scientist has studied anything. So you have to only ask the fishermen there. And one particularly knowledgeable fisherman is Kaliyappan. He lives in a village called Tengumarada. It's a remote village. So I went to Tengumarada, I hunted up Kaliyappan, very nice man. He had been fishing in the Moyar River and all its tributaries for some 30 years. And then I spent some days with him. We camped on the bank of Moyar. He caught fish, and of course we had very good dinners of fresh fish. And we talked, and he told me a whole lot about the fish species, their habitats, and how the management of the water, including the hydroelectric projects, had been affecting them, and biosphere reserves consequences. I made detailed notes. This was all in Tamil, of course. I knew bits and pieces. But one of my students, Prabhakar, who is a native Tamil speaker, was with me. So although I understood quite a bit, Prabhakar understood it fully, so we composed a full account. I took it to Jayaraman. He said, fine. All I can add is zoological names of these fishes. Everything else, what Kaliyappan said, seems perfectly correct. And he is the authentic source of knowledge. So there is this tremendous amount of knowledge with people at the ground level. Now in 2002, we passed in the Lok Sabha, the government of India passed an act called Biological Diversity Act. And it talks about involving people at the grassroots in documenting biological diversity. The most violent critiques, I was very much in favor of this act, I was involved in that. The most violent critiques I encountered were, unlike Jayaraman, many other botanical and zoological survey of India scientists who felt very threatened that there was this notion that knowledge of people like Kaliyappan would be recognized and recorded, and we will lose our importance. So these are, of course, the Kodabis who are Kaliyappans, and the scientists, unfortunately full of dambha, were attacking and continue to, I am afraid, attack the implementation of Biological Diversity Act. So how did science progress? Now, traditionally, including in Europe, there was this separation between practical arts, actually empirically dealing with the world, and scholarship, theoretical understanding of the situation. The history of science tells us that science really took off in Europe when artisans and scholars began to talk together, began to come together. I will come to it in a moment. A very interesting event was Pascal, the great mathematician, talking to the glass blowers of Rouen and taking advantage of the skills of the artisanal skills of the glass blowers of Rouen and things like that. When the practitioners of practical arts began to communicate to the scholars and such communication was established, science began to get into it's actually began to blossom. So the history of science says that the sudden burst of activity in 17th century Europe was the result of the union of speculative thinking and deductive reasoning, which is the domain of the scholars, with cut and dry empirical experimentation, which is the domain of the artisans. And a famous case study done by Brian Conant, who was a major figure in history of science. He was a professor of chemistry actually at Harvard and later president of Harvard. He has this detailed case study of the pumps and the understanding of how pumps functioned. Now, mining had become important in Europe, and they were trying to go fairly deep. But when they are pumping out water from the mines, no pump could, one pump could raise water more than 10 meters. So they had to have them in a series to bring out water. Engineers began to ask why. Why is it that water cannot be lifted in these pumps more than 10 meters? And they asked Galileo, and Galileo could not answer. Another Italian, Gasparo Berti, he set up experiments. And the experiment was this one. Is the laser pointer work? Here. That he had this tub of water and a tall lead pipe with a bulb here, much more than 10 meters tall. He filled this pipe with water, inverted in the tub, and saw how much water was left. Not all water flew out at all. About 10 meters column of water remained in the pipe. So this is exactly the height which the engineers were thinking of. And obviously, you had a clear connection between the two. So now, as the discussion went on, there was a question of two alternative interpretations. One was the Aristotelian interpretation. More than 17 centuries, Aristotle's authority had held fast. Aristotle said that nature abhors vacuum. And therefore, one theory was that since nature abhors vacuum, vacuum of any large size cannot be created. That is why that much water is left in the pipe. The other theory was no, it is atmospheric pressure that is balancing the pressure exerted by that column of water, and there is no question of nature not tolerating vacuum, abhorring vacuum. Vacuum can exist. It is the atmospheric pressure. Actually, what is atmosphere was not clear. And now the theory propounded was that just like in the bottom of the ocean there is considerable water, atmosphere is a fluid also, and that we are at the bottom of this column of atmosphere, and that is the pressure. Eventually, a whole lot of interesting experiments were done, and Aristotle's authority was overthrown. For the first time in a way, it came to be clearly accepted that empirical verification and not authority is important. So let me tell you the story of a very interesting empirical verification which was coupled to the theoretical deductions also. This was Pascal's experiment. Now Pascal heard of this, he was in France in Rouen, heard of this Berthi's experiment, and he reasoned as follows, that if this is the case, then you take a fluid which is less dense than water. Then the column which will be supported by atmospheric pressure would be taller than 10 meters. And which is a fluid which has a lower density than water. And of course, French are fond of red wine. He said red wine. And in Rouen, he got the glass blowers to blow a glass pipe. Berthi had used a lead pipe, a glass pipe much taller than 10 meters. And then he had all this red wine, filled this glass pipe with red wine, and the column should be taller than 10 meters. In the square of Rouen, he had this experiment, and of course everybody was fascinated. Whole town came to witness the experiment, and lo behold, the column of red wine was higher than 10 meters. So clearly, as I said, Pascal contributed further by relating density to the height. Others did also, and amongst them was Torricelli, who was important, who said, let's use mercury instead. Mercury is some 13 odd times denser than water, so the column would be much shorter, only 76 centimeters, and that's our mercury barometer. Pascal said, fine, so let us do some experiments. So Pascal was lazy about climbing hills, but his brother-in-law was a avid mountaineer. So he had this mercury, equivalent of today's mercury barometer. His brother-in-law carried it to the top of a mountain in France, and yes, it was verified that the height of the mercury column was much lower. They didn't know, of course, how much lower it would be. And it turned out that it was very substantially lower. So Pascal calculated, look, even a 100-meter height would make a difference. And there is the Cathedral of Notre Dame. So as a good showman again, just like as he did with the red wine experiment, he had this experiment carried out in Paris in the Cathedral of Notre Dame. And somebody was sent to the top of the cathedral tower. And yes, the column was lower than 76 centimeters, as actually by then calculated by Pascal. And Pascal was rewarded, amongst other things, by a big statue of Pascal standing in the Cathedral of Notre Dame today. So, with these developments, as European science made headway, authority gave way to empirical observation, logical deductions, and science came to be accepted as a systematic enterprise of skepticism. You must doubt everything, you must ask questions about everything, no authority. There should be open access to all facts and inferences. You must only accept the authority of empirical facts and logical deductions, and everybody has the right to question all assertions as to facts as well as to logic. So science declares not Saushayatma Vidashyati as Gita declares, but Saushayameva Jayate, that skepticism is the key to progress of knowledge. A small story about Ayurveda. As I said, Vadbhata made Ayurveda accessible to people of all castes. Among them were Ilavas. And Ilavas had two major professions. Some of them were Vaidyas, and the others were primarily toddy tappers. And these were people who had real contact with the natural world. And they were meat eaters. Unlike many other Ayurvedic Vaidyas who only read Ayurveda from the Sanskrit texts, who did not go out collecting plants, and who did not eat meat, so they had forgotten all about animal anatomy. But Ilavas knew all this. So in a way, as in Europe, practitioners of practical arts came together with scholarship in these, amongst these Ilava Vaidyas. And in the history of botany, a famous text is Hortus Malabaricus, which is considered to be a classic of botany. The Dutch governor of Fort of Cochin in Kerala, he had commissioned a number of Vaidyas from Kerala to give a detailed description of the Ayurvedic plants they use for the various maladies. And of course, in the European tradition, all these plants were also illustrated. The Ayurvedic Nighantus which were being prepared never had any illustrations. So the identity of lot of Ayurvedic plants even today are very dubious. So in that sense, Cornelius van Ried made a major contribution by recording what the Ayurvedic practitioners were using in Kerala, and amongst the most prominent of the contributors to Hortus Malabaricus was this Iti Achyutan Vaidyan, who was an Ilava, as I said. This became a text which was an inspiration for Carl Linnaeus. Carl Linnaeus, who is the founder of the modern biological system of classification. But this was, as I said, an isolated incidence. The gulf between practical arts and scholarship, it was bridged in Europe, and science took root there, but it was never bridged in India. And modern science did not take root here, I think primarily because scholarship and practical arts remained divorced, isolated from each other. Now, as science prospered, obviously openness, sharing were important values, and they began to be appreciated in Europe as beneficial to the society. And you have in 1766 the first ever act of freedom to information. This is the freedom to Freedom of the Press Act of Sweden in 1766. And there onwards, in the European society, there has been this tussle between desire to establish monopoly and accepting the importance of opening up knowledge to everybody. And the compromise that Europe developed was the Patent Acts. Now, Patent Acts are accepting monopoly for a limited period for making knowledge public. You cannot get a patent on anything unless you make the knowledge public, but you demonstrate that it is novel and useful and non-obvious, and you may get a patent for 10 years, 20 years, whatever. So this was the compromise Europe developed. And of course it is claimed that patent is very important, patent is essential, patent regime is essential for economic growth, and of course economic growth is being worshipped today. Now, I want to tell an interesting story of the fallout of patent regime. And this is the story of the anti-knock compounds added to automobile fuel. In the 1920s, the automobile industry in the United States took off after the First World War. Enormously, the demand for automobiles began to grow. It was an important player in the economy. Now the petroleum which was being used produced knocking in the engines, and that knocking had to be brought down. There were two candidates for eliminating knocking. One was ethyl alcohol, and ethyl alcohol is indeed completely effective in getting rid of this knocking in the engines, automobile engines. But of course, nature has been producing ethyl alcohol for a very long time, and people have been drinking ethyl alcohol for a very long time, and nobody can patent ethyl alcohol molecule. So what do? So you had to invent, the American industry, the chemical industry and petroleum industry decided they must invent a molecule which can be patented, and then actually pretend and force it down everybody's throat, saying that this is far better than ethyl alcohol, and that is tetraethyl lead, and lead is dangerous. And indeed, in the initial, now there is a long, the story of tetraethyl lead has been documented in great detail. Initially, there was a lot of opposition to tetraethyl lead, and there was good scientific evidence being propagated, widely disseminated, saying ethyl alcohol is equally effective, but the both the chemical industry and the petroleum industry used their money power effectively to suppress all this. And they persuaded the US Department of Health to give monopoly of research over the possible ill effects of tetraethyl lead to research sponsored by the industry. And all independent research was killed. And the industry sponsored research actually propagated a whole lot of falsehood. And this is how tetraethyl lead continued to be used from 1926 to 1986, 60 years. How was this finally broken? There is a very interesting story. Anyway, just to recount, in the 1930s, there are two very interesting texts. One by J.D. Bernal, who was the father of crystallography and modern molecular biology in a way. He has this book called Social Functions of Science. And the one quotation I like from that is, "Science is a systematic enterprise of skepticism," as I said. And Whitehead, who is mathematician, philosopher, he has this book called Adventure of Ideas, in which he has another interesting statement: "Science anchors itself to the hard bedrock of objective facts, however unpalatable they may be." Now, of course, the fact that tetraethyl lead was a serious menace to health of people and also to the health of the biosphere was a very unpalatable fact to petroleum and chemical industry, which was very powerful in the United States. And as I said, for 60 years, they managed to continue producing and using tetraethyl lead. How was this finally overthrown? The story is fascinating. The man who did this is Clare Patterson. He was a geochemist. And during the Second World War, amongst others, he worked with the Manhattan Project, where he was, his thesis involved separation of various isotopes of different elements, in particular separation of isotopes of lead, amongst other things. That was part of his Second World War thesis. I mean, it had nothing to do with World War. University of Chicago thesis carried out in parallel with his work on Manhattan Project. Now, at that point, he realized, and one of the senior atomic scientists, in fact, at the Manhattan Project told him that, look, you must very carefully date meteoroids which have lead in them and the proportion of different isotopes in these meteoroids. That will allow you to make a definitive estimate of the age of the Earth. As a geochemist, Patterson was fascinated. Yes, he wanted to make this definitive estimate of the age of the Earth. Eventually, in 1956, he published his estimate, 4.56 billion years, which was quite different from the estimate then accepted. But from 56 to today, this remains the accepted estimation. Now, but in the process, now when he was trying to estimate the proportion of different isotopes of lead in these meteoroids, he discovered that it was impossible to create a clean laboratory. He needed a clean laboratory to make these estimates. And he began to find out that the atmosphere was full of lead. And to create a clean laboratory was a Herculean effort. So he began to ask, why is there so much lead in the atmosphere? And he, of course, came to the conclusion it was the tetraethyl lead. And he began to look at the literature. And the literature kept on saying that, no, the kinds of levels of lead that you find in the atmosphere in the 1950s in the United States is close to the natural levels of lead in the atmosphere. He began to doubt it, because he then very carefully looked at a whole lot of other biological and other evidence, and he came to the conclusion this cannot be the natural level of lead in the atmosphere. This is much heightened. Anyway, he managed to create a clean laboratory, did his work and published this famous paper. After which he decided that he will challenge this propaganda going on, that actually there is a very high level of lead as which is the natural level in the atmosphere. And he did all sorts of things, including going to the ice cores in the Antarctica and the Arctic, and also looking at bones buried in remote places in South America 10,000 years ago. I think he is here with one of those bones. And he demonstrated eventually in this other paper, 1965 paper, that no, the lead levels in the atmosphere in the 50s, 60s in the United States were probably 100 times higher than the natural levels, which were to be found as evidence from these ancient bone burials and old ice and so on. And this was, I mean, he was a very competent chemist, geochemist, and his work was immediately accepted by the scientific communities when this paper came out. But it took another 20 years for the commercial pressure to yield and finally tetraethyl lead to be banned. In any case, so this whole monopoly over knowledge, this whole issue of deliberately propagating misleading facts as scientific facts is not something only in the ancient history, but continued even today, certainly very recently as demonstrated here, and continues all along. Now, in India, now my interest, I'm an ecologist, and I am interested in the status of environmental information in India. And this has been my major interest for many years. And of course, almost all information available on environmental issues in India comes from government sources. They have the monopoly over monitoring the environment. And they are Laozi's faithful followers. They believe in keeping people ignorant. So, although all the time claims are made that these are all scientific monitoring exercises being undertaken by whether it is the Project Tiger Authority or Maharashtra State Pollution Control Board or whoever, actually the data is incomplete, poor quality, and often genuinely fraudulent. Let me give you an example of a clearly fraudulent piece of data which I encountered in some years ago. You might recall, this is now 10-year-old story. There was a outcry about tigers in Sarishka. Sarishka is a reserve close to Delhi, so very popular. A lot of people, visitors, foreign visitors also, and Indian tourists used to visit Sarishka for seeing tigers. And tigers came to be slowly rarer and rarer sight in the as years progress from 1998 onwards. But the forest department kept on saying, no, tigers have been, there are as many tigers as there ever were. There is no problem. And why are not people seeing it? So finally, in 2005, Prime Minister set up a tiger task force, asked to look into this issue. If there are so many tigers, as the forest department says, why are they not being seen? So I was a member of the task force. So I believe in talking to people. Now, of course, my other members are very nice people. They only talk to forest officers over a glass of whiskey or whatever in the evenings, and they had their source of information. But then I went to Sarishka Reserve and I talked to the forest guards, and I said, this is the issue. So what is happening to the tigers? They said, sir, of course they are disappearing. And I said, but is there any documentary evidence other than the official counts being circulated by the forest department. They said, sir, yes, we keep diaries, and in the diaries we make our estimates of number of tigers in the Sarishka Reserve, and we'll show you our diaries. So the records which I compiled from the diaries are in the third row, 1998 onwards, so you can see the official census and the records I got from the forest guards from their diaries. And of course the forest guards were saying that ऑडिटोरियम मध्ये का नाही सोडलं मला माहिती नाही. Anyway, so the guards' estimates clearly showed that tigers were being poached out, and there was of course all sorts of corrupt practices going on, because the tiger skin and tiger bone and tiger penis, all sorts of things had tremendous market, especially in China, and a whole lot of people were involved in that poaching, and the official figures were bogus figures. Now this table is part of the official Tiger Task Force report, but of course no action has ever been taken on those who propagated this official census figures. Anyway, so this is not atypical. This is the kind of information which is the information available about the status of environmental parameters in India. However, we have a democracy, which in many ways is very effective. So we have a whole lot of acts relating to environmental protection, and acts which demand environmental monitoring, proper monitoring of the status of environment. We also have acts which promote democratic devolution, and indeed, as I mentioned, there is a biological diversity, I don't know if I mentioned, anyway, there is a Biological Diversity Act of 2002, which says that all local bodies, including, for instance, Pune Municipal Corporation and all panchayats, should set up citizens' biological diversity monitoring committees, which will be involved in monitoring of the environment. Now, if, for instance, in Pune Municipal Corporation, there was a citizens' biodiversity monitoring committee, which should have been set up 13 years ago, but if not 13 years ago, a National Biodiversity Authority came into being in 2004 and supposedly initiated the implementation of Act throughout the country in 2004, last 11 years, and all this dispute going on about techniques and construction on the hills and how much biodiversity there is on the hills. It is the construction lobby is helped very considerably by the fact that no proper record is available of biodiversity resources on the hills. And of course, it is these kind of lobbies which have made sure that no biodiversity management committee exists in Pune. I have been trying for a long time to try to see that one will come into being. Vandanatai Chavan, who was a mayor, she was very much in favor of this, and we had long discussions, and she tried, but it has failed to come into existence. So all these keeping people ignorant, keeping information, not collecting information as it should be collected, and getting involved, getting people involved in collection of information, all of this is being systematically sabotaged. The Western Ghat Ecology Expert Panel, which was established in 2010, and we submitted our report in 2011, committed the great crime of documenting all this. So as a part of the report, we document all the constitutionally accepted provisions of environmental monitoring which were not, none of which are being implemented. Constitutionally accepted provisions for involving citizen monitoring which are not being implemented, and we gave very concrete examples of the very negative consequences of this. And let me quickly quote just one example. There is a chemical industries complex at a place called Lote in Chiprun Taluka of Ratnagiri district. This chemical industry complex has a common effluent treatment plant which simply does not work. And the effluent, which is basic, almost all of it untreated, very seriously toxic, is coming out and getting into streams there and also into Vashishti River and Dabol Creek, which were once one of the richest fishing areas in Konkan. Now, there are from time to time massive fish kills because of this pollution. And from time to time, fishermen who are adversely affected demonstrate. I collected a record from Ratnagiri Collector's Office of the frequency of these demonstrations and the government's response, and the record says, the record I was able to access was for 600 days previous to October 2010. Record says that out of 600 days, 180 days, there were anti-pollution demonstrations in Ratnagiri district. Or on every one of the 180 days, the collector evoked some police powers to maintain law and order and suppress those demonstrations. But the pollution, which is very clearly well above all acceptable legal limits, no action has been taken. And the Pollution Control Board does not record pollution levels. It does not, it never records these massive fish deaths. It so happened that over long years I had a lot of students. One of them became chairman of Karnataka Pollution Control Board. Now throughout the country there are these kind of fish deaths, including their big one here in on our Bhima river. From time to time large scale fish deaths occur. So I asked this student who was then chairman of Karnataka Pollution Control Board, in Karnataka also, on Tungabhadra river, many places these fish deaths occur. Are you not recording them? He said, no, Madhav, we have been ordered never to record any such things. So this is the Pollution Control Board. Then he was going to Delhi to attend the meeting of chairman of all state pollution control boards called by Central Pollution Board. I said, will you please ask them what is happening in other states? He came back and said, yes, Karnataka is on par with all other states. In all states of India, the orders from the governments are never to record incidents like these large-scale fish deaths. What is Pollution Control Board doing then? So the question was, well, as I said, all these kind of things we recorded in our panel report. So government first suppressed it, then when under Right to Information Act, they had to make it available. They made it available willy-nilly, but we had said that it should be made available in Marathi and Kannada and Malayalam and all other languages. They never did so. They only have it in English on the web pages. So most of the citizens of Western Ghats do not know English. So it is unavailable to them. Only in Kerala, Kerala Sahitya Parishad published a full Malayalam translation. And very interestingly, they told me that the day the Malayalam translation of our report came out, within one day, 1,000 copies were sold. So there was genuine public demand for reading what it was in the report in languages which people understood. Now, Maharashtra government, knowing that, of course, people want to know what is in this report in Marathi, did a very clever thing. They published a so-called Marathi summary of our report at the official website, which is a deliberate distortion of what is in the report. And I know the secretary at that time who was in charge. I had known him for many years. He's a very active member of Bombay Natural History Society also. I told him, why are you doing this? You asked me to give a genuine translation. You have word limit, fine. You say 3,000 words, whatever, I will give you. He laughed and he said, no, no, we have to publish only this distorted version. So that is the current situation. And what can we then do as citizens? And I have been thinking of that. Fortunately, government no longer has monopoly over information. And therefore it is possible, especially because of the modern information communication technology revolution, to do something different. And citizens can themselves get actively involved in generating, propagating information, as they are doing over Facebook, for example. But Facebook has limitations, serious limitations, because there is no mechanisms to ensure that only correct, valid information will be propagated. But you have a medium which is a social medium, which has put in lot of effort in developing mechanisms to make sure that what is recorded is quite reliable. Wikipedia is this social medium. And of course, in 2000, since it was first mooted, and 2001, when it came into the present form, I have been reading articles in Wikipedia, and it is remarkable how reliable, good information on all sorts of scientific topics is now becoming available through this medium. But I was under the impression, I had never thought it very seriously, that it was primarily scholars who were reading Wikipedia. Then 2 years ago, I had a great revelation. So I have two granddaughters, and I, of course, have many teachers. Among them are Tara and Revati, and they teach me the latest Bollywood songs and dances. So they said that, look, now you must learn Lungi dance. That is the most popular dance of the times. So they started teaching me Lungi dance, and started Mucha ko thoda round घुमा के अन्ना जैसा चश्मा लगा के, so all the Rajni fans don't miss this chance, fine. So I'm learning Lungi dance, and suddenly I pricked my ears because it said, घर जाके Google कर लो, मेरे बारे में Wikipedia पे पढ़ लो. So Wikipedia is not remained confined to scholars. Wikipedia has become part of Bollywood culture. So I said, no, this is something one must take very seriously, that apart from using it to learn about scholarly topics, which is what I was doing, one must think of the possibilities. And the possibilities are, I think, quite remarkable. Now, the material is created collaboratively by people. Initially, in 2000, the experiment was done of confining writing articles only to scholars. But, scholars are generally very reluctant to write anything for free. So scholars did not write any articles. So in 2001, they decided that, look, scholars are not writing any articles. Let anybody write articles, but we must make sure that they are authentic. So everybody must give proper references. Anybody, it is open, Wikipedia is open to everybody to edit, to write new articles, but they must give proper sources of information, and everybody can verify the sources of information and point out mistakes, and the information will improve in quality. And one very interesting remark was made by Ward Cunningham, I think. He was the inventor of this wiki software. He said, scholars love nothing more than pointing out mistakes of others. So once everybody is allowed to write, scholars will also carefully read and point out mistakes. So mistakes will disappear. And indeed, this is what has happened. That no less than the scientific journal Nature made a study of the quality of articles in Encyclopedia Britannica and Wikipedia, and came to the conclusion that Wikipedia, the accuracy was on the par with Encyclopedia Britannica. Just because continually it is open to scrutiny and only reliable information is allowed to persist. So this is a wonderful medium, and it is available even in a whole lot of languages. Indeed, their declared intention is to make all human knowledge available to all people freely in all their own languages. So we have 21 Indian language Wikipedias. Of course, the English language is certainly the largest one with some 50 lakh articles. But even in Marathi Wikipedia, there are 42,000, and in Hindi Wikipedia about a lakh or so. So you have interesting possibilities. The article topics can be all sorts of topics, and I talked about this fish mortality, so let me stick to that. So there is an article in Wikipedia on fish mortality, and interestingly enough, I have not yet gone, I should go and edit that and add other information. It says that there is hardly ever large-scale fish mortality due to toxic pollution. But in India, of course, all the time there is large-scale fish mortality due to toxic pollution. People from US have been and other places have been writing where perhaps water pollution is really kept under control. But we can write these. And certainly, although the Pollution Control Board refuses to record fish mortalities, all sorts of newspapers continually publish well-documented reports about fish mortality. In Sakal, you might have been reading about this mortality near Bhigwan, for example. Recently, there was one large scale. In Panchaganga River in Kolhapur, there are all the time large-scale fish mortalities which are recorded in newspapers. So these can be part of information which can be incorporated in the Wikipedia. And how do we start? So we have since Wikipedia is very keen on authentic information, you have to start with some authoritative source of information, any article. One of the projects which with number of friends I am now trying to pursue is to have an article about every village and every town and every city in Maharashtra. There is an article on Pune, not a very good one, but it exists. But on many other smaller places, there are no articles. But you can start with the census information. 2011 census has very good information on even the smallest of the village in Maharashtra. That can be used to start an article, and then when and of course it has a very, the Census of India has a very good system. Every location has a unique location code. The pin codes are of no use. The whole Gadchiroli district has a single pin code. But in Gadchiroli district, there are several hundred villages, each of which has in the census a unique location code. So you can use those to characterize them. There are a lot of problems otherwise, because in Maharashtra itself there are large number of Vadgavs and so on. So you have to use something like this. So with this we can start an article, and we have as I said, with this group we have started, and the geographical location based articles, a small Scala program has been written to automatically generate from the census basic articles, which can then be incorporated if anybody is interested. Just one link I have given here. Rukdi village in Kolhapur district on Panchaganga river, where an article now exists in Marathi Wikipedia, and people have added a whole lot of news items about Panchaganga river pollution in that article. So now this information, which as I said, Pollution Control Board refuses to record, but the newspapers do record, now can become part of verifiable information in the public domain. And of course, this can also be in English and Hindi, and as I said, in many other Indian languages. Now, Wikipedia has started a very interesting experiment called Wikidata, which is a multilingual facility, so that if in various Indian language Wikipedias you have, say, articles mentioning large-scale fish mortalities, all that data from all the various Indian language Wikipedias can also be compiled and an all India database on fish mortalities throughout India can be created. This would be, as I said, a very worthwhile database, because river pollution is a very serious issue all over India, and without any authentic information being available, because of indeed deliberately wanting to keep people ignorant. So it is up to us, and we can do it, and we can create this information and organize it given all these modern facilities. This is what I was talking about. So as I started by saying that these are times, tragic times, because of the destruction of nature that is going on. But these are also very happy times for those who are interested in knowledge and information. And the challenge of using the good things about our times to try to combat the bad things about our times, this might be one way to use a system like Wikipedia and all the Indian language versions to create sound information and use that information to then combat, using all the legal provisions to all these exist, except that we must now operationalize them, and sound information will certainly help in creating pressure for operationalizing them. So I think this is one enterprise which especially the scientific community could find very rewarding. Anyway, it is this what I am currently really committed to do, and I am grateful to Ayuka and of course all of you for this opportunity to share these ideas with you. Thank you very much.